It was supposed to be a celebration, our 10th anniversary, an evening of laughter, elegance, and toast to the future I once believed we'd share. The restaurant gleamed with golden light, every table adorned with crystal glasses and white roses. I'd spent hours choosing my dress, a deep emerald silk that he once said made my eyes look alive. I remember hoping he would notice. Instead, the first thing he did was glance over me and mutter, "Try not to make a scene tonight." Those words landed quietly, but they bruised louder than a shout. Throughout dinner, he performed the part of a charming husband. He laughed too loudly, ordered the most expensive wine, and sprinkled compliments to everyone except me. His colleagues and their wives filled the table, faces I'd only seen at corporate events, the kind of people who looked at you as if your value could be measured by the sparkle on your wrist. I smiled, small and polite, keeping my hands clasped in my lap like a schoolgirl desperate to behave. The waiter poured champagne. My husband rose, glass in hand, tapping it lightly to command attention. "A toast," he announced, grinning with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. "To 10 years of marriage. 10 long years." A few chuckles rippled around the table. He paused, eyes glinting with something that wasn't love. "And to my beautiful wife, who may not have given me children, but at least she's given me patience." Laughter followed. Some nervous, some genuine. My chest tightened. The world tilted in slow motion. Every sound dulled except the thud of my heart. I could see the pity forming on their faces, their eyes darting between us. My husband sipped his drink as if he'd said something clever, something harmless. But he knew what he'd done. He wanted me small, humiliated, trapped beneath the weight of his words. I felt my throat tighten, the urge to cry clawing its way up, but I smiled instead. A faint, practiced curve that hid the storm underneath. Someone changed the subject. The waiter cleared plates. I heard murmurs about investments, vacations, everything ordinary, but I was no longer there. My body sat among them, yet my spirit had already drifted to a quieter place, a corner of my mind where his cruelty couldn't reach. I studied the way his hands moved as he gestured through stories, how his laughter filled spaces meant for kindness. For the first time, I saw the man behind the performance, and I realized how long I'd been applauding his act. When dessert arrived, he leaned close enough for his breath to brush my cheek. "Don't look so dramatic," he whispered. It was a joke. The bitterness in his tone twisted the word joke into something sharp. I nodded, swallowing the apology he wanted to hear but didn't deserve. Around us, the room sparkled. Candles flickered. My reflection shimmered in the wine glass. Eyes steady, lips silent. I discovered that night that silence can scream louder than any confrontation. As we left the restaurant, he wrapped an arm around my waist for show. Cameras flashed from a nearby table of acquaintances, and he smiled like a man adored. But beneath his hand, my spine straightened. My silence wasn't submission anymore, it was armor. He didn't know it yet, but the woman walking beside him was no longer trying to be loved. She was remembering every word, every smirk, every public wound. And in that memory, something powerful began to stir. That was the night my marriage ended, though neither of us said it out loud. It ended quietly, between a raised glass and forced applause. It ended when I realized that the man who once promised to protect me was the one who enjoyed watching me bleed behind my smile. And while everyone else laughed, I was already writing the first line of the story that would one day end his lies. They never knew about the night I lost our baby. No one did. Not his mother, who still calls to remind me how a woman's worth is in what she gives. Not his colleagues, who clap him on the back for being such a patient husband. Not even my own friends who think I chose career over children. He made sure the truth was buried beneath charm and convenience, the way he buries every uncomfortable thing that threatens his perfect image. It happened 3 years into our marriage. I was 7 weeks pregnant, fragile, terrified, but hopeful. I'd found out alone, clutching the test in trembling hands. When I told him, he barely looked up from his phone. He said we'd talk later, that he had a meeting. Later never came. That evening, I waited with dinner growing cold while he texted someone else, someone whose name I would learn too late. When the cramping started, I thought it was stress. By the time I collapsed in the bathroom, he still hadn't come home. At the hospital, the doctor spoke gently, his words blurring into a dull hum. I remember the smell of antiseptic, the sharp sting of IV fluid, and the emptiness inside me. When my husband finally arrived the next morning, he looked annoyed, not concerned. "You should have called sooner," he said. I wanted to scream that I had, that he just hadn't answered. But grief swallowed my voice. I signed the forms. I went home hollow. He never mentioned it again. Over time, he turned my silence into ammunition. He told people I'd had complications and that we tried, but she couldn't carry. He'd lower his voice, sigh deeply, and play the martyr, the man married to a broken woman. And I let him at first. I thought protecting my privacy meant protecting my dignity. Instead, it protected his narrative. The worst part wasn't the lie itself. It was how easily everyone believed it. My mother-in-law sent articles about fertility diets. Friends offered sympathetic smiles that felt like pity. At gatherings, when someone mentioned children, my husband would squeeze my hand just tight enough to remind me who controlled the story. I learned to laugh softly, to change the subject, to live inside the silence he'd built for me. But grief never disappears. It lingers, reshaping itself into something sharper. I began to see patterns, how every cruel comment, every manipulation, traced back to his fear of losing control. He needed to be admired. He needed to be the victim in every story, and I had been his favorite prop. That dinner, years later, was only the public version of what I'd already lived in private. The humiliation wasn't new, it was simply louder. Yet something changed that night, because as he joked about my barrenness, I remembered the baby we lost. I remembered his absence, his betrayal, the quiet hospital room where I promised myself I'd never be powerless again. That memory didn't break me. It reminded me of what they didn't know, and what I still could make them see. After the dinner, the house felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, cold, and filled with things that had lost their meaning. The leftover perfume of roses from the restaurant clung to my hair, mocking me with sweetness I didn't deserve. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, unsure which version of myself belonged here. The smiling wife from the pictures on the wall, or the woman who had just been publicly humiliated by her own husband. The silence was unbearable, yet I couldn't break it. It was the same silence I'd lived with for years, only now it echoed louder. He came home late that night, reeking of wine and applause. "Don't be so dramatic," he said when I didn't answer his jokes. "People were laughing with me, not at you. That's what narcissists do. They convince you that pain is humor, that cruelty is affection, that humiliation is a misunderstanding." I wanted to believe him. I always did, because believing him meant I didn't have to face the truth. I had married a liar, and worse, I had been complicit in his performance. The next morning, I stared at my reflection. My eyes looked foreign, vacant, dulled by years of small betrayals I'd learned to swallow. Every memory began to unravel, replaying with new clarity. The time he forgot to pick me up after my surgery because of a work crisis. The way he told his family I'd quit my job to focus on home life, when in truth, he'd pressured me until I broke. The countless apologies that came wrapped in expensive gifts and hollow promises. I realized then that his kindness had always been a transaction, a down payment on my compliance. Days blurred. He carried on as if nothing had happened, still charming, still adored. I pretended too, pouring his coffee, nodding at his stories, laughing when appropriate. But inside, something was shifting. The silence between us was no longer fear. It was observation. I started noticing how he thrived on control. The way he corrected my words mid-sentence. The way he twisted sympathy out of every situation. He had rewritten our entire history, transforming my pain into his platform. At night, I replayed the dinner in my mind, the smirks, the whispers, his smug grin. I thought of how easily he'd turned a room full of people into his audience. That's what hurt most. Not the insult, but the applause that followed. They didn't know they were clapping for a performance rehearsed over years. They didn't know I was the cost of his charm. On the fourth day, I woke before dawn. He was asleep, peaceful as a man without conscience. I sat at the edge of the bed and watched him breathe. I wondered how many lies it took to build a life this convincing. Then I realized he wasn't just lying to others. He was lying to himself, and I had spent years trying to save a man who never wanted redemption, only validation. The silence that morning wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, deliberate, sacred. It held the truth I'd been too afraid to say out loud, that the man I loved didn't exist. He was a mask made of charm and deceit, and beneath it there was nothing but hunger, for control, for image, for praise. That realization didn't come with anger or tears. It came with calm clarity. The kind that whispers, "This is the end of what was, and the beginning of what comes." It was a rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon the envelope. I wasn't looking for it. I was trying to find old tax papers he'd insisted I misplaced. The drawer stuck halfway, like it didn't want to open, and when I tugged harder, a thin white envelope slipped out and landed on the floor. My name was written across it in neat handwriting I recognized instantly. Dr. Patel's. My heart stopped. She had been my physician years ago, the only one who ever truly looked me in the eye when I cried about my miscarriages, about my body's supposed betrayal. My hands trembled as I slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a single letter, yellowed slightly at the edges. I read the first few lines once, then again. It stated, in gentle but undeniable words, that I was healthy, fertile, that my miscarriage had not been caused by anything wrong with me. The letter explained that after my procedure, Dr. Patel had tried to contact my husband for additional tests, but he never followed up. His own condition, low motility and untreated infection, was the real culprit behind our infertility. The words felt like both salvation and poison. For years I had carried his blame like a brand on my skin, and here it was, the proof that it was never mine to bear. I sank to the floor, clutching the letter. Memories flooded back, his cruel jokes, the subtle digs, the way he'd shake his head when people asked about children, sighing as if I were a burden he nobly endured. He had known. Deep down I realized he must have known. Maybe not the medical details, but enough to twist the truth into a story that protected his pride. That's what he always did. Rewrite reality before anyone else could challenge it. I thought about all the years I spent apologizing for my body, praying for miracles that were biologically impossible. I thought of his mother's pitying looks, the way she whispered to relatives that some women just can't give what men need. And he let her. He let them all, because to him, preserving his image was worth more than preserving my dignity. The rain outside grew heavier, thundering against the windows as if the sky itself was raging with me. I pressed the letter to my chest. For the first time in years, I felt something electric under the grief. Justice. This piece of paper was more than a diagnosis. It was liberation. Proof that I wasn't broken. Proof that he was. And as that realization settled in, something inside me hardened into resolve. I placed the letter back in the envelope, smoothing the creases. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I smiled. A small, quiet smile that tasted like victory long delayed. This was my weapon, my truth, the one thing he couldn't twist or laugh away. I tucked the envelope into a separate folder and locked it in my drawer. I didn't yet know how I'd use it, but I knew I would. For years, he had written the narrative. But that day, with that envelope in my hands, I realized something vital. The story was finally mine to tell. Next. Once the truth about the envelope sank in, it was as if a fog had lifted. Suddenly, every inconsistency, every odd comment, every late-night business trip took on new meaning. I began noticing details I'd once brushed aside. The double phone he guarded like a state secret. The bank statements that arrived already opened. The sudden bursts of generosity followed by longer absences. For years I'd accepted these as quirks of a successful man. Now they were clues. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was an investigator living inside my own marriage. It started small. I checked his desk when he left for meetings, flipping through folders he thought I'd never touch. That's when I found the first fake business account, an offshore transfer labeled as consulting fees. I didn't understand the full mechanics, but I recognized the signature, his. My stomach turned as I realized he wasn't just lying about me. He was lying to everyone, including his partners. I took photos of everything, quietly, methodically, like a woman taking notes for her own trial. Each discovery led to another. A hidden email thread with a woman named Vanessa, dated during the same weeks he'd told me he was in Dubai, closing a deal. The language was intimate but businesslike, a mix of flirtation and strategy. I realized she wasn't just a fling, she was leverage. He'd built his empire on manipulation, seducing whoever helped him climb higher. It wasn't just infidelity, it was currency. Every affair, every lie, every financial trick was part of a grand illusion, one that depended on the image of the devoted, successful husband with the tragically barren wife. At first, I felt numb. Then anger burned through the numbness, steady and focused. But it wasn't the wild, consuming anger I'd once felt. This was different, cold, tactical. I understood now that if I confronted him too soon, he'd spin the story as he always did, turn my truth into hysteria. No, this time he wouldn't see me coming. I would learn his game, play it better, and make him choke on his own performance. Over the next weeks, I watched him more closely than ever. Every word he said in public was a thread I traced back to its origin. I learned he was on the verge of sealing a multi-million-dollar merger with a family-owned firm that prided itself on ethical integrity. The irony made me almost laugh. The deal hinged on one thing, his reputation. He had sold them an image of a loving, stable husband, a man whose marriage symbolized trust. That's when the strategy began to form in my mind. His empire wasn't built on truth. It was built on perception. So all I had to do was shift perception and let the truth finish him. But before I could act, I needed more proof. Late one night, after he fell asleep, I unlocked his laptop. His password was our anniversary date. Of course it was. I found folders labeled personal, clients, and, ironically, faith. Inside were photos from luxury trips he'd never mentioned, dinners with the same colleagues who had laughed at me, and documents that showed he'd been siphoning money through a shell company in Vanessa's name. Every file was another fracture in the illusion. I saved everything to a flash drive and hid it in the lining of my jewelry box, the one he'd bought to make up for forgetting my birthday. Each secret I uncovered made me feel stronger, less afraid. The woman he mocked at dinner was gone. In her place stood someone sharper, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. He thought silence was my weakness. He was wrong. Silence was my preparation. One evening I watched him host another dinner, laughing too loud, touching my shoulder in that performative way he always did when others were watching. I smiled back, the perfect wife, my mask flawless. Only I knew the truth now, that his entire identity was a collapsing house of cards. Every lie, every stolen glance, every false charm was fuel for the reckoning he didn't see coming. That night, as I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair, I caught my reflection and barely recognized her. There was something new in my eyes. Not fear, not sorrow, but calculation. The letter in the drawer, the evidence on the flash drive, his growing arrogance, it was all aligning into a single, inevitable outcome. He had written a story where I was powerless, but he'd forgotten one crucial thing. I was the only one who knew the ending was about to change. There's a strange power in pretending. The first morning after I decided to play along, I greeted him with coffee and a soft smile. He blinked, clearly expecting cold silence or another argument, but I simply asked about his meeting. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to him. I was controlling the scene. And the irony wasn't lost on me. He, the man who once staged my humiliation in front of others, now stood disarmed by my gentleness. My calm unnerved him, though he couldn't name why. I began reconstructing myself piece by piece. I started dressing better, not the simple, subdued tones he liked, but bold colors, clean lines, things that made me feel visible again. He noticed. "You're glowing lately," he said one night, his voice full of false affection. I smiled. Maybe I finally stopped worrying so much. He laughed, thinking it was a compliment to him. I let him believe that. It was safer if he did. At dinners, I listened to his stories, laughed at his predictable jokes, and refilled his wine before he asked. The guests whispered about how we seemed stronger than ever, how we'd weathered the storm. I played the perfect wife again, but this time, the role was mine to define. Every glance, every touch, every word was a chess move, positioning him closer to his own downfall. He had no idea that behind every polite nod was a countdown. I started going to the gym again, taking long walks by the lake, even returning to my old hobbies, painting, writing, reading. At first, he seemed pleased, assuming my revival meant his control had worked, but the truth was simpler. I was building distance, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. The version of me he broke was gone, and the silence he once weaponized had become my armor. When he'd try to provoke me with passive insults, tiny daggers disguised as jokes, I'd respond with measured indifference. "You're so sensitive," he'd mutter. "Not anymore," I'd answer softly. At night, I'd lie awake listening to his breathing, thinking how strange it was to share a bed with someone who had no idea he was sleeping beside the storm he'd created. I no longer felt hatred, just clarity. Hatred gave him too much importance. Now, he was simply an equation to solve, and I had every variable on my side. The flash drive remained hidden. The envelope sat in a safe place. The truth waiting patiently was my quiet companion. The people around us, the ones who'd witnessed my humiliation, began to warm up again. They called, invited us to gatherings, praised our renewed bond. I accepted every invitation, wearing elegance like a second skin. The same crowd that once laughed at me was now drawn to my composure. It was intoxicating to watch them believe in the performance, to see how easily the world forgave the man who smiled convincingly. But what they didn't know was that the stage was being rebuilt for his final act, and I was the one arranging the lights. In those calm days before exposure, I found an unexpected peace. I no longer obsessed over what he thought or did. I detached from the chaos he thrived on. Each morning I could breathe again, deep, unhurried, real. The house felt less like a prison and more like a temporary set. I even began to hum while cooking, something I hadn't done in years. He noticed that too. "I like this version of you," he said. "Do you?" I asked, smiling. "Then enjoy her while she lasts, because soon, very soon, the version of me he adored for her silence would give him exactly what he deserved, the most elegant ending to his own story. The invitation came embossed in gold, thick as pride itself. He handed it to me one evening, his voice dripping with performative warmth. "Our biggest dinner yet," he said. "Investors, family, press, everyone who matters. You'll wear that silver gown I bought, yes?" I smiled faintly. Of course. He didn't see the flicker behind my eyes. This wasn't just another night for him to preen. It was the perfect stage, and I was finally ready for the curtain to rise. The venue was a private rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, a glittering sea of glass and ambition. Every table sparkled with crystal and laughter, and every smile was calculated. He thrived in spaces like this, where applause replaced affection. I walked beside him, serene and radiant, my gown flowing like moonlight. In my clutch, the small ivory envelope rested silently, light as truth, heavy as consequence. As guests arrived, he moved through the crowd like a man auditioning for sainthood. His voice carried easily, polished, confident, rehearsed. "My wife's been my greatest strength," he told a group of investors, squeezing my shoulder for emphasis. "She's the reason I've built what I have." They nodded, charmed, unaware that his empire stood on deceit. I tilted my head and smiled, the perfect portrait of devotion. Inside, my pulse was steady, my mind sharpened by calm anticipation. Every lie he uttered only strengthened my resolve. Dinner was a symphony of indulgence. Wine flowed, laughter echoed, and the city lights shimmered around us like an audience of stars. I caught glimpses of familiar faces, family, friends, the same people who had pitied me during my lowest moments. They whispered about how I looked different, more confident. "She's glowing," I heard someone murmur. They thought it was happiness. It was closure. When he stood to toast, the room fell into reverent silence. He raised his glass, smiling that practiced, camera-ready smile. To success, he began. To love. To the woman who stood by me through everything. He looked at me as if expecting gratitude, as if his lies deserved applause. I met his gaze, soft and steady, the faintest curve on my lips concealing everything I knew. In that moment, the world saw a man in control, but I saw a puppet whose strings were already unraveling. After the toast, he drifted back into conversation, basking in his own legend. I excused myself, claiming I needed air. On the balcony, the city stretched endlessly below, a maze of lights and possibilities. I opened my clutch and traced the envelope's edge with my fingers. Inside were the documents that proved everything: his condition, his fraud, his deceit. Evidence that would end his deal, his reputation, and his carefully crafted persona. The letter from my doctor had started it. But this was the culmination. As I returned to the table, he turned to me, smiling. "You okay, darling?" "Perfect," I said softly, placing the envelope beside his plate. "Just something I wanted you to have before dessert." He glanced at it, curious but didn't open it yet. Instead, he turned back to his guests, laughter resuming, champagne pouring. But I saw it, the faint unease in his eyes. The kind of discomfort only truth can summon, even before it's spoken. I leaned back in my chair, breathing in the faint scent of roses and ambition. Around us, music swelled, cameras flashed, and the man who had mocked my silence reveled in his illusion one last time. My calm was absolute. My revenge wasn't chaos, it was elegance. The envelope lay between us, small and unassuming, yet powerful enough to end him. And as the waiter cleared the plates, I knew that when he finally opened it, the echo of his laughter would never sound the same again. The room glittered beneath chandeliers, laughter bouncing off glass and silver. My husband thrived in this kind of light, attention warm on his skin, admiration feeding his ego like oxygen. I sat beside him, my smile perfectly measured, fingers resting lightly on the stem of my glass. The ivory envelope sat beside my clutch, quiet and patient. Around us, guests toasted, complimented, flattered. Everything he'd ever wanted was here. Validation, wealth, power. And tonight, it would all begin to unravel. He tapped his glass for attention, his favorite sound, the promise of an audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice rich and self-assured. "Tonight isn't just about business or success. It's about gratitude." The crowd leaned in, eager. "About the people who stand by us when times are hard." He turned toward me, eyes gleaming with performative tenderness. "My wife," he said, placing a hand on mine, "has given me everything. Stability, grace, and understanding, even when she couldn't give me the one thing every man dreams of." A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the guests. Some smiled politely, others shifted in discomfort. The words hung there, soft and cruel, dressed in charm but barbed with humiliation. He savored it, the control, the subtle dominance of public pity disguised as praise. "But you know," he continued, "a man learns that love isn't about what we lack, it's about what we build together. And for that, I'm thankful." My face didn't change. I smiled, the same way I'd learned to smile when bleeding inside. But this time the pain didn't sting. It crystallized into precision. I stood slowly, my chair whispering against the marble. Every eye turned toward me. He looked pleased, expecting an emotional tribute, maybe even tears. Instead, I raised my glass. "To my husband," I said, voice calm, clear. "For teaching me that silence can be powerful, that sometimes the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." There was a pause. He chuckled nervously. "Always poetic," he said, trying to reel back control. I took a step closer, resting my hand lightly on the back of his chair. "And for reminding me," I continued softly, "that even the deepest lies can't hide forever." The air thickened. A few guests exchanged glances. He froze, smile faltering just slightly. I reached for my clutch and pulled out the ivory envelope, placing it gently beside his glass. "You might want to read this before dessert," I said, my tone kind, almost affectionate. The words slipped into the air like silk, but landed like a stone. His fingers hovered above the envelope, confusion clouding his face. "What's this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "A little truth," I replied. "Something we can all digest together." The guest chuckled uncertainly, unsure if this was a joke. I sat back down, folding my hands neatly in my lap. The silence that followed was louder than applause. He finally tore the seal, unfolding the letter that had slept in my drawer for months. His eyes scanned the words once, twice. Color drained from his face. The letter from my doctor, signed, dated, undeniable, stated in black and white that his untreated condition, not mine, had caused our infertility. The truth glared at him beneath the candlelight, merciless and final. A hush fell. Someone coughed. The investors at the table looked at each other, their smiles fading into whispers. My husband opened his mouth, but no words came. I leaned in slightly. "It's amazing," I murmured. "How medical facts survive even after years of lies." He looked at me, panic flickering in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. The mask cracked. I lifted my glass again. "To truth," I said softly. "May it always find its way to the surface." I took a sip as he sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hand. Around us, conversation began again, low, uneasy, curious. My heart didn't race. It slowed, steady as victory. I had imagined this moment countless times. But reality was quieter, cleaner. It wasn't about vengeance or spectacle anymore. It was about balance being restored. The toast was over. The illusion was over. And as he sat there surrounded by the same crowd that once pitied me, I realized he was finally the one exposed, naked, wordless, and utterly alone. He stared at the envelope like it was a foreign object, something that didn't belong on his polished table. The faint tremor in his hands betrayed the first crack in his armor. Guests leaned forward, curiosity flickering in their eyes. I didn't speak. I sat, serene, my fingers lightly brushing my glass, letting the moment stretch. The anticipation wasn't for me, it was for him. For the first time, he was the one under scrutiny, and the air shifted around him like a storm gathering over calm seas. He tore the envelope slowly, as if delaying the inevitable might change its contents. The first document he pulled out was from Dr. Patel, my former physician, confirming what I had long known and he had long feared. He was infertile, and I was healthy. My heart stayed steady, but I could feel the room tense, an almost tangible pressure building. His eyes widened, a flash of disbelief flashing across his face before it hardened into panic. The words, clinical and precise, left no room for spin. The lie he had built his life upon was crumbling. Then came the financial documents, meticulously collected over weeks. Shell companies, hidden accounts, falsified income streams, all linked back to him. The files revealed the truth he had tried to bury. Fraudulent transfers, offshore accounts, and expense claims for lavish dinners, trips, and gifts that didn't exist on any legitimate ledger. It was proof not only of greed, but of the careful, deliberate persona he had constructed to deceive everyone. Investors gasped softly, their polite smiles freezing into expressions of shock. Family members leaned closer, whispering questions that he could no longer answer. Finally, I slid the last document across the table. It was evidence of his affairs, the meticulous correspondence between him and Vanessa, dates, emails, and photographs linking him to deception that had spanned years. His colleagues glanced at each other nervously. Investors shifted uncomfortably. Even the people who had adored him now looked at him differently, as though seeing a stranger. My husband, the man who had always been in control, was suddenly rendered voiceless. "Is this?" he began, but no words could finish the sentence. His mouth opened and closed, fumbling for an excuse that didn't exist. The laughter and murmurs around the table rose into a low hum, the polite veneer of the dinner dissolving in the wake of undeniable truth. He had relied on charm, on misdirection, on the assumption that his story was untouchable. Now every carefully staged smile, every whispered lie, every cruel joke about me came rushing back at him in full, public clarity. I sat back, observing quietly, my calm a stark contrast to his growing panic. Investors exchanged glances, phones subtly capturing the moment. Family members who had once pitied me looked at me with new understanding. Some leaned over, whispering affirmations that had never reached my ears before. For years I had suffered in silence, hiding grief and humiliation. Tonight that silence was my ally. It magnified every reveal, every piece of evidence, every undeniable truth. He slammed his hands on the table. This isn't true. His voice cracked, revealing a man stripped of authority, stripped of his polished persona. The room didn't answer. There was no laughter to rescue him, no gasps of sympathy, just eyes, watching, judging, understanding. I could see it clearly. The man who had mocked my inability, who had spun tales of my failures, was now powerless in the very room where he had once thrived. I stood, gracefully, like someone stepping out of a shadow into the light. My dress swirled around me as I gathered my clutch and the empty envelope, leaving the documents behind for the world to digest. I paused at the doorway, letting my gaze linger on him. He looked smaller somehow, diminished not by force but by truth itself. He opened his mouth again, but I had nothing to say. The story had spoken for itself. As I walked away, the murmurs followed me, whispers rising into a crescendo of shock, disbelief, and finally understanding. The high heels clicking on marble echoed like a verdict. Each step carried years of betrayal, pain, and humiliation that had been silenced until now. For the first time in decades, I felt unburdened, untethered from the lies that had defined my life. The truth had unfolded, and I had orchestrated it with precision. Outside, the cool night air embraced me, a stark contrast to the stifling luxury of the restaurant. I inhaled deeply, tasting freedom, tasting justice. Behind me, he remained trapped in a room of people who now saw him clearly. I didn't look back. The lights, the cityscape, the murmurs of revelation were all part of a world I had reclaimed for myself. And as I disappeared into the quiet night, I felt a peace I hadn't known since the moment he first called me barren. The morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter, warm and indifferent, as if the world had no memory of last night's chaos. My phone buzzed incessantly. Messages, emails, notifications piling up like breadcrumbs leading to the truth. Investors had pulled out, the merger collapsed, and headlines already hinted at financial impropriety and personal scandal. Social media rippled with whispers, speculation, and a growing recognition of what had truly been hidden behind polished smiles and curated photos. And I was untangled from it all. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the quiet settle around me. There was no triumph in my thoughts, no gloating over his downfall. Only relief. The weight I had carried for years, the humiliation, the grief, the constant rewriting of my own story, had finally lifted. I felt the edges of myself soften, the tension in my shoulders dissolving. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what he deserved. I was thinking about what I wanted. Peace, freedom, and a life unshadowed by his lies. The messages kept coming, some from family, others from business contacts who were now wary of associating with him. Each notification confirmed what I already knew. His empire of deceit had crumbled, not with shouting or rage, but with quiet truth and patience. I allowed myself a small private smile. Years of humiliation had forged something stronger than bitterness, something subtle, unshakable, and enduring. My revenge had been delivered not in chaos, but in clarity. I began making plans, tentative at first. A move abroad had always seemed impossible, a luxury reserved for dreams I'd postponed to accommodate his needs, his whims, his illusions. Now it felt attainable. I envisioned a new apartment, a new city, mornings filled with possibilities rather than dread. I imagined walking streets where my reputation wasn't defined by someone else's lies, where my past could remain intact yet no longer dictating my future. Emails confirmed my escape. Visa paperwork, rental agreements, and job prospects aligned in a seamless, almost miraculous way. It was as if the universe had been waiting for the moment the truth was exposed to open its doors. The irony was not lost on me. Years of careful planning, quiet observation, and unspoken strategy had culminated not in spectacle, but in liberation. I sat back in my chair, watching the sun climb higher. The city outside continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the private storm that had just passed through its towers. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel gratitude. Not toward him, not toward fate, but toward my own resilience. I had endured the manipulation, the cruelty, and the public shame. I had waited, watched, and finally acted. And now, I could leave it all behind. I texted a few trusted friends, letting them know I would be gone soon. Their replies were filled with encouragement, wonder, and relief. They had seen my suffering, my quiet endurance, and now they could celebrate the woman who had emerged whole on the other side. I didn't need to recount the details. The envelope, the documents, the silent orchestration of truth. These were mine alone. No one else needed to witness them to know the power of what had been done. By noon, the house felt lighter. The echoes of last night's chaos had faded, leaving only silence filled with potential. I began packing, not in haste, but with a deliberate, calm rhythm. Each item folded, each suitcase zipped, symbolized a layer of my past left behind. The man who had mocked me, manipulated me, and sought to define my worth was now just a memory in a city that would continue without him. And as I closed the door behind me for the last time, I didn't look back. There was no thrill, no bitterness, only the quiet, radiant satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The world was vast, waiting, and finally I was free to exist beyond manipulation, beyond lies, and beyond the shadow of someone else's ego. I stepped into the morning light, suitcase in hand, ready to start again, leaving the ashes of the past where they belonged. Months later, I found myself in a sunlit space that smelled faintly of paint and possibility. The small art studio I had purchased felt like a sanctuary, a place untouched by his lies, untouched by anyone's expectations but my own. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, illuminating canvases that had yet to be painted, waiting for my hands, my vision, my voice. Each brushstroke would be mine alone, a celebration of self and survival. I thought back to the envelope, the dinner, the silence that had spoken louder than any confrontation. That quiet, deliberate truth had undone years of deception without a single raised voice. It had been enough. I realized then that I had misunderstood power for so long. I had imagined it as explosive, as dramatic, as the kind of vindication that screamed in public spaces. But the truth had taught me otherwise. Power wasn't in the spectacle. It was in clarity, in patience, in the calm that lets lies collapse under their own weight. I didn't need to humiliate him further. I didn't need to broadcast his failure. That had already happened naturally, with elegance and precision, because I had waited, observed, and acted deliberately. Truth had been my ally, and it had spoken louder than any anger ever could. As I arranged my brushes and set up the easel, I reflected on the years I had lost to fear and shame. I had carried the weight of his ridicule, internalized the public laughter, and endured his subtle manipulations. And yet, here I was, free to create, free to define my own life. The city outside pulsed with energy, but inside this small studio I felt grounded, sovereign over my own story. I was no longer reacting to someone else's narrative. I was writing my own, in color, in line, in shape, and in form. A client came in one afternoon, curious about my work. I smiled, showing her the blank canvas. "It's just waiting," I said. She nodded, understanding that the act of creation itself was a form of courage. I thought about how the envelope, the documents, the dinner, they had all been catalysts. But this space, these walls, this freedom, was the real reward. The revenge had been subtle, nearly invisible, yet absolute. And in that subtlety, I had discovered something profound. Lasting power doesn't roar. It whispers, persistent and unassailable. I often return in thought to that evening, the glittering room, the envelope resting lightly beside his glass. I remember the tension, the silent justice, and the look on his face when reality reached him. But the memory no longer stirs anger. It only reminds me that I had trusted myself, trusted the evidence, and trusted the quiet strength I had cultivated over years. The world had applauded him for years, and I had watched silently. Then when the time came, I revealed the truth with precision. That had been enough. That still is enough. Now, surrounded by light, color, and space to breathe, I have a new understanding of what it means to live fully. My work on canvas mirrors my life, deliberate, expressive, and unbound. Each stroke is a reminder that control over one's own narrative is the most potent force we possess. I no longer fear whispers or judgment, because the voice that matters most has always been my own. My final thought each day, as the sun sinks below the skyline and paints the studio in amber light, is my own quiet motto. Power isn't loud, it's silent when truth speaks. It is not arrogance, nor pride, nor vengeance that fuels me. It is the knowledge that I have endured, survived, and emerged whole. That the past, with all its betrayals and lies, no longer holds sway. That the life I create now is entirely mine. And in that truth, there is freedom, strength, and infinite possibility. The envelope rests in my memory as much as it did in my hands that night. Small, ivory, unassuming, yet carrying a weight that shifted the course of my life. Once it was just a piece of paper tucked among old files, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. But in that quiet, deliberate moment, it became more than a document. It became a key, a witness, a catalyst. It proved that silence, patience, and careful observation could wield more power than anger, confrontation, or theatrics. Every letter, every signature, every line etched by my doctor and meticulously preserved by me had rewritten the narrative that had once trapped me. I often think about the years I spent bearing humiliation in private, enduring jokes, whispers, and veiled cruelty. How many times had I swallowed my pain, folded my dignity into a quiet corner, and convinced myself that endurance was all I could muster? How many nights had passed with clenched fists under the sheets, silent tears on my pillow, thinking, what can I do? No one would believe me? And yet, that envelope was a reminder that sometimes one quiet truth can carry the weight of years of injustice. That revelation didn't need shouting or spectacle. It only needed presence, courage, and timing. The power of the envelope wasn't in its threat. It was in its existence. It was the evidence of reality, untouched by manipulation, indestructible by lies. He had spent years constructing illusions, reshaping the story to fit his pride. But the envelope ignored illusions. It simply was, and in that being, it carried the force to topple his empire, restore my dignity, and free me in ways I hadn't even dared imagine. Every time I reflect on it, I feel both awe and gratitude. Awe at how something so simple can hold such magnitude, and gratitude for the clarity it brought me, the path it revealed, and the peace it ultimately delivered. I wonder how many people live bound by silence when the truth could liberate them. How many hide evidence, keep secrets, or endure humiliation because confrontation seems impossible or terrifying? How many carry invisible weights, unaware that a single decisive act could reclaim their lives? I hope my story offers more than voyeuristic thrill. I hope it sparks courage, reflection, and recognition. That the envelope, modest and quiet, reminds others that their power lies not in revenge, but in truth, patiently gathered, thoughtfully delivered, and unassailably real. Looking back, I realize the envelope's impact extends beyond the events of that night. It transformed me from victim to strategist, from silent sufferer to orchestrator of my own liberation. Its weight was not a burden but a responsibility, a reminder that control over one's narrative is a treasure, and truth is the ultimate instrument of justice. I carried it discreetly, deliberately, and when the time came, it spoke louder than any accusation, any confrontation, any public spectacle ever could. And in that quiet potency, I discovered that freedom doesn't need noise to be complete. It only needs clarity and courage. Even now, as I sit in my new life, surrounded by light and space I chose for myself, the envelope lives in memory, teaching me still. It whispers the lesson I will carry forever, that patience and truth together are invincible, that the weight of what is real can collapse a house of lies without raising a hand. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds me that silence, when combined with clarity and courage, is not weakness. It is power, a quiet, enduring force that can reshape lives, rewrite histories, and liberate those who dare to honor it.